Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. Episode 7. Isabella continued her story. This morning when I came down, about half an hour before noon, I found Heathcliff leant against the chimney. Mr. Earnshaw was sitting by the fire, deadly sick. I asked him how he was. "Every inch of me is sore," he replied. "Yes, no wonder," I said. "Catherine used to boast that she stood between you and bodily harm. She meant that certain persons would not hurt you for fear of offending her. Well, it's well people don't really rise from their grave, or last night she might have witnessed a repulsive scene." "What do you mean? Did he dare to strike me when I was down?" "He trampled and kicked you and dashed you on the ground," I whispered. Mr. Earnshaw looked up to the countenance of our mutual foe, who, absorbed in his anguish, seemed insensible to anything around him. "Oh, if God would but give me strength to kill him, I'd go to hell with joy." "No, it's enough that he has murdered one of you," I observed aloud. "Your sister would have been living now had it not been for Mr. Heathcliff. When I recollect how happy we were, how happy Catherine was before he came, oh, I curse the day." "Get out of my sight," said Heathcliff. "I beg your pardon," I replied, "but I loved Catherine too, and her brother requires attendance which, for her sake, I shall supply. I see her in Hindley. He has exactly her eyes. If you had not tried to gouge them out and made them black and red, and her—" "Get up, idiot, before I stamp you to death!" he cried, making a movement that caused me to make one also. I continued holding myself ready to flee. "But then, if poor Catherine had trusted you and assumed the ridiculous, contemptible, degrading title of Mrs. Heathcliff, she would soon have presented a similar picture. She wouldn't have borne your abominable behaviour quietly." He snatched up a dinner knife from the table and flung it at my head. It struck beneath my ear, and I sprang to the door. The last glimpse I caught of him was a furious rush on his part, checked by the embrace of his host, and both fell locked together on the hearth. I flew down the steep road and across the moor, and far rather would I live in hell than even for one night abide beneath the roof of Wuthering Heights again. Isabella ceased speaking, and turning a deaf ear to my entreaties for her to remain another hour, she kissed me and descended to the carriage. She was driven away, never to revisit this neighbourhood again, but a regular correspondence was established between her and my master when things were more settled. Her new abode was in the south, near London. There she had a son, born a few months subsequent to her escape. He was christened Linton, and from the first she reported him to be a weak, miserable creature. Mr. Heathcliff discovered her place of residence and the existence of the child. He didn't trouble her. He often asked about the infant, and when he saw me, and on hearing its name, smiled grimly and observed, "They wish me to hate it too, do they?" "I don't think they wished to know anything about it," I answered. "But I'll have it," he said, "when I want it." Fortunately, its mother died before that time arrived, when Linton was 12 or a little more. On the day succeeding Isabella's unexpected visit, I had no opportunity of speaking to my master. He shunned conversation and was fit for discussing nothing. When I could get him to listen, I saw it pleased him that his sister had left her husband. For a few days he seemed regardless of the puny successor to the departed, but that coldness melted as fast as snow in April, and ere the tiny thing could stammer a word or totter a step, it ruled his heart. It was named Catherine, and formed to him a connection with the mother, his attachment springing from its relation to her more than from its being his own. The end of Earnshaw followed fast on his sister's, There were scarcely 6 months between them. Dr. Kenneth came to announce the event to my master. "Well, Nelly," said he, riding into the yard one morning, "Hindley Earnshaw has died true to his character. Drunk, poor lad. He was barely 27. I could not hinder myself from pondering the question. Had he had fair play? Whatever I did, that idea would bother me, so I requested leave to go to Wuthering Heights and assist in the last duties to the dead. Mr. Linton was extremely reluctant to consent, but I pleaded that my old master had a claim on my services. Besides, I reminded him that the child Hareton was his wife's nephew, and in the absence of nearer kin he ought to act as its guardian. And he must inquire how the property was left and look over the concerns of his brother-in-law. He was unfit for attending to such matters then, but he bid me speak to his lawyer, and at length permitted me to go. His lawyer had been Earnshaw's also. I called at the village and asked him to accompany me. He shook his head and advised that Heathcliff should be let alone, affirming that Hareton would be little else than a beggar, that his father had died in debt, and that the whole property was owed to Heathcliff. When I reached the Heights, Mr. Heathcliff said that I was not wanted, but that I might stay and order the arrangements for the funeral if I chose. "That fool's body should be buried without ceremony of any kind," he remarked. "Yesterday afternoon he fastened the 2 doors of the house against me and spent the night drinking himself to death deliberately. We broke in this morning, and there he was, laid over the settle. I sent for the doctor, and he came, but not till the beast was dead and cold." Just when the people were bearing the coffin from the house, Heathcliff lifted the unfortunate child, Hareton, onto the table and muttered, "Now, my lad, you are mine, and we'll see if one tree won't grow as crooked as another with the same wind to twist it." "The boy must go back with me to Thrushcross Grange," I said. "There's nothing in the world less yours than he is." "Does Linton say so?" he demanded. "Of course. He has ordered me to take him," I replied. "Well," said the scoundrel, "I have a fancy to bring him up. Tell your master that I will fill this place with my own if he attempts to remove it. I don't promise to let Hareton go, but I'll be sure to make the other come." This hint was enough to bind our hands, and Edgar Linton spoke no more of interfering. The guest was now the master of Wuthering Heights. He held firm possession, and proved to the attorney, who in his turn proved to Mr. Linton, that Earnshaw had mortgaged every yard of land he owned for cash to supply his madness for gambling, and he, Heathcliff, was the mortgagee. In that manner, Hareton, who should now be the first gentleman in the neighbourhood, was reduced to a state of complete dependence on his father's enemy, and lived in his own house as a servant without wages, quite unable to right himself because of his friendlessness and his ignorance that he had been wronged. The 12 years following that dismal period were the happiest of my life. Little Catherine was the most winning thing that ever brought sunshine into a desolate house, a real beauty. Till she reached the age of 13, she had not once been beyond the range of the park by herself. Mr. Linton would take her with him, a mile or so outside, but he trusted her to no one else. The chapel was the only building she had entered except her own home. Wuthering Heights and Mr. Heathcliff did not exist for her. The sharp edge of Penistone Crags particularly attracted her notice. I explained that they were bare masses of stone. "Oh, but you have been on them," she cried gleefully. "Then I can go too, when I am a woman. Has Papa been, Ellen?" "Papa would tell you, miss," I answered hastily, "that they are not worth the trouble of visiting. The moors where you ramble with him are much nicer, and Thrushcross Park is the finest place in the world." She asked Mr. Linton about it, and he promised that she should have the journey when she got older. "Now am I old enough to go to Penistone Crags?" was the constant question on her lips. The road thither wound close by Wuthering Heights. Edgar had not the heart to pass it, so she received as constantly the answer, "Not yet, love, not yet." Mrs. Heathcliff lived around a dozen years after quitting her husband. What her last illness was I am not certain, but she wrote to ask her brother to come to her, for she wished to bid him adieu and deliver Linton safely into his hands. Her hope was that Linton might be left with him, as he had been with her. My master went at once, commanding Catherine to my charge, in his absence, with orders that she must not wander out of the park, even under my escort. He was away 3 weeks. Catherine used to go around the grounds on her pony and often remained out from breakfast till tea. I did not fear her breaking bounds, because the gates were locked, and I thought she could scarcely venture forth alone if they had stood wide open. Unluckily, my confidence was proved misplaced. One afternoon she never made her appearance at tea. Neither she nor the pony nor her 2 dogs were visible in any direction. There was a labourer working at a fence on the borders of the ground. I inquired of him if he had seen her. "I saw her at morn," he replied. "She leapt over at hedge yonder where it's lowest, and galloped out of sight." It struck me directly that she must have started out for Penistone Crags. I walked mile after mile till a turn brought me in view of the heights, but no Catherine could I detect, far or near. "Oh, and what if she should have slipped," I reflected, "and been killed, or broken some of her bones?" My suspense was truly painful, and at first it gave me delight, relief, to observe, in hurrying by the farmhouse, one of her dogs lying under a window with a bleeding ear. A woman who had been servant there since the death of Mr. Earnshaw greeted me. "Ah," she said, "you are come a-seeking your little mistress. Don't be frightened, she's here safe, but I'm glad it isn't the master." "He's not at home then, is he?" I panted. "Oh, no, she replied. "Both he and Joseph are off. I think they won't return this hour or more." I entered and saw Catherine seated in a little chair that had been her mother's when a child. She was laughing and chatting to Hareton, now a great strong lad of 18, who stared at her with considerable curiosity and astonishment. "Very well, miss," I exclaimed. "This is your last ride till Papa comes back. I'll not trust you again, you naughty girl." "Oh, Ellen," she cried gaily, "you found me out. Have you ever been here in your life before?" "Home at once," said I. "I'm dreadfully grieved at you, Miss Cathy. You've done extremely wrong." "What have I done?" sobbed she, instantly checked. "Well, Miss Cathy, if you were aware whose house this is, you'd be glad enough to get out." "It's your father's, isn't it?" she said, turning to Hareton. "Nay," he replied, looking down and blushing. He could not stand a steady gaze from her eyes, though they were just his own. "Whose then? Your master's?" she asked. He coloured deeper, with a different feeling, muttered an oath, and turned away. "Who is his master?" continued Cathy, appealing to me. "He talked about our house. I thought he was the owner's son, and he never said miss. He should have done, if he's a servant." Hareton grew black as a thundercloud. "Get my horse," she said, addressing her unknown kinsman, as she would one of the stable boys at the Grange. "I'll see thee damned before I be thy servant," growled the lad. "You'll see me what?" asked Catherine in surprise. "Damned," he replied. "But Ellen," cried she, "how dare he speak to me so? Mustn't he be made to do as I ask him?" "Softly, miss," said the woman. "Mr. Hareton be not the master's son, is your cousin." "He? My cousin?" cried Cathy. "Oh, Ellen, don't let them say such things. Papa is gone to fetch my cousin from London. My cousin is a gentleman's son." I was much vexed at her and the servant for their mutual revelations, but I could scarcely refrain from smiling at her dislike of Hareton, poor fellow, who was a well-made athletic youth, good-looking in features and stout and healthy, but dressed as a labourer. I thought I could detect in his face a mind having better qualities than his father ever possessed. Mr. Heathcliff, I believed, had not treated him physically ill. He appeared to have spent his malevolence on making him a brute. He was never taught to read or write, and was never rebuked for any bad habit. Miss Cathy and I set out for home. As I supposed, the goal of her pilgrimage was Penistone Crags, but near the gate of the farmhouse, Hareton happened to issue forth with his dogs, who attacked her. They had had a battle, and that formed an introduction. Catherine had told Hareton who she was and where she was going, and asked him to show her the way. I had to obtain a promise that she would not lay the grievance before her father. I explained how he objected to the whole household at the Heights, and said that if she revealed any negligence of his orders, he would perhaps be so angry that I should have to leave. Cathy couldn't bear that. She pledged her word and kept it for my sake. After all, she was a sweet little girl. A letter, edged with black, announced the day of my master's return. Isabella was dead, and he wrote to bid me arrange a room for his youthful nephew. The evening of their expected arrival came, and at last the carriage rolled in sight and halted at the front steps. Linton was a pale, delicate boy. "This is your cousin Cathy, Linton," said his uncle. "She's fond of you already, and mind you don't grieve her by crying tonight. Try to be cheerful now, the travelling is at an end." "Let me go to bed then," answered the boy, shrinking from Catherine's salute and using his fingers to remove his tears. "He'll do very well," said the master to me, "if we can keep him, Ellen. The company of a child his own age will instil new spirit into him." "Aye, if we can keep him," I mused to myself, and felt there was slight hope of that. Our doubts were decided even earlier than I expected. I had just taken the children upstairs and seen Linton asleep, when a maid informed me that Mr. Heathcliff's servant Joseph was at the door and wanting to speak with the master. Very reluctantly I went up to the library and denounced the unwelcome visitor, who followed me up and pushed me into the room. "Heathcliff has sent for his lad, and I mun go back without him." Edgar Linton was silent a minute. He grieved bitterly at the prospect of yielding him up, and searched in his heart how it might be avoided. No plan offered itself. There was nothing left but to resign him. However, he was not going to rouse him from his sleep. "Tell Mr. Heathcliff," he answered calmly, "that his son shall come to Wuthering Heights tomorrow. He is in bed and too tired to go the distance now. You may also tell him that the mother of Linton desired him to remain under my guardianship, and at present his health is very precarious." "No," said Joseph. "Heathcliff take no account of the mother nor you, but he'll have his lad, and I mun take him." "You shall not tonight," answered Linton decisively, and aiding the indignant elder with a lift by the arm, he rid the room of him and closed the door. "Very well," shouted Joseph. "In morning he'll come himself and turn him out, if you dare." To avoid the danger of this threat being fulfilled, Mr. Linton commissioned me to take the boy home early on Catherine's pony, and, said he, "You must say nothing of where he is gone to my daughter. She cannot associate with him hereafter, and it is better for her to remain in ignorance of his proximity, lest she should be anxious to visit the Heights. Merely tell her his father sent for him suddenly." Linton was very reluctant to be aroused from his bed at 5 o'clock, and astonished to be informed that he must prepare for further travelling. "To see my father?" he cried in strange perplexity. "Mamma never told me I had a father. Where does he live? I'd rather stay with Uncle." We halted before the farmhouse garden gate, and before he dismounted, I went and opened the door. It was 6:30. The family had just finished breakfast. "Hello, Nelly," said Mr. Heathcliff. "I feared I should have to come down and fetch my property myself. You've brought it, have you? Let us see what we can make of it." He got up and strode to the door. Hareton and Joseph followed in gaping curiosity. Poor Linton ran a frightened eye over the faces of the three. Heathcliff uttered a scornful laugh. "God, what a beauty! What a lovely, charming thing! Oh, damn my soul, but that's worse than I expected, and the devil knows I was not hopeful." I bid the trembling and bewildered child get down and enter. He was not yet certain that the grim, sneering stranger was his father, and on Mr. Heathcliff's bidding him "Come hither," he hid his face on my shoulder and wept. "Oh, tut, tut," said Heathcliff, dragging him roughly between his knees and then holding up his head by the chin. "None of that nonsense. We're not going to hurt thee, Linton. You are your mother's child entirely. Where is my share in you? Do you know me?" "No," said Linton with a gaze of vacant fear. "You've heard of me, I dare say." "No," he replied again. "No? You are my son. I'll tell you, and your mother was a wicked slut to leave you in ignorance of the sort of father you possessed." "I hope you'll be kind to the boy, Heathcliff," I said. "He's all you have in the wide world." "I'll be very kind to him. My son is prospective owner of your place, and I should not wish him to die till I was certain of his being successor. Besides, he's mine, and I want the triumph of seeing my descendant lord of their estates. That is the sole consideration which can make me endure the whelp. I've engaged a tutor to teach him. I've ordered Hareton to obey him. I do regret, however, that he so little deserves the trouble. I am bitterly disappointed with the whey-faced wretch." Having no excuse for lingering longer, I slipped out, but as I closed the door, I heard a cry. "Don't leave me! I'll not stay here! I'll not stay here!" But they did not suffer him to come forth, and so my brief guardianship ended.